The very definition of disappointment is the non-fulfillment of expectation. And so there's a clear relationship between these two. Disappointment can only come from expectation. And it's often said that if you have no expectations, you'll have no disappointments. But expectation seems to arise spontaneously and even subconsciously, which is to say that we're often unaware of our expectations until we find ourselves disappointed, and only then does it become clear to us. But by then we're already upset. We might be sad or frustrated or angry, all of the things that come with disappointment. So the question is, can we learn to live in such a way that we have no expectations to begin with, and in that way we never find ourselves disappointed? Expectation is the belief that circumstances will unfold in a particular way, and oftentimes our expectations are based upon our personal desires, and we can be very attached to whatever the desired outcome might be. And it's not as if our expectations are always unrealistic or unreasonable either. Sometimes they might be very reasonable. But the problem is that life doesn't always go our way, and when reality doesn't match up with our expectations, then naturally we find ourselves disappointed. And the more that we're attached to a particular outcome, the more disappointed we're going to be when it doesn't work out. The fact of life is that reality doesn't always conform to our expectations. Now and then it might match up, but quite often it doesn't. And there's really no written law that says that life is supposed to conform to our expectations. But when they do go unfulfilled, we often get upset, whether that comes out in some kind of rage, or whether it's sadness, or even just a subtle sense of discontent and dissatisfaction. And we'll often complain that life isn't fair, but what does that really mean? Who's to say that life is supposed to grant us everything we desire? Is the universe under some obligation to fulfill our wishes? So this idea of life being unfair is really rooted in the belief that life is supposed to comply with our expectations, and that in and of itself is really just another expectation. And with that kind of expectation, life itself becomes a great disappointment. This isn't difficult to understand, and I think that most of us do understand this when we actually take the time to really look at it. Yet for some reason we go on repeating this cycle of expectation and disappointment. So the real question is what to do about it. Is there a way that we can keep from having these expectations in the first place? Now, in my own life, I've noticed how my expectations have decreased over time, decreased in frequency as well as intensity. And it's only because I've taken time to really observe and bring attention to the relationship between expectation and disappointment. So the way to go about this is to simply bring our awareness to the process, to simply observe as expectations and disappointments arise, and to understand the relationship, not merely intellectually, but more importantly, through experience. And as I mentioned before, expectations seem often to arise spontaneously and subconsciously, and so often we don't recognize that they're there until the disappointment sets in. So something that I've learned to do whenever I feel disappointed, rather than simply be overwhelmed by the sadness or the anger, I take a moment to step back and ask myself, what was it that I was expecting? Because I know that if I'm disappointed, there's an expectation there somewhere. So what was it? And I want to know, not so I can try again to fulfill it, but so that I can let go of it. And when I'm able to identify it and release it, the disappointment goes as well. But not only this, but in time, that same expectation is less likely to arise again. Now, it might come back up, but it may come up less frequently and with less intensity. That is, I might find myself having the same expectation again and again, but each time I'm less attached to it. Through observation, I've learned that reality doesn't match up with our expectations, and that this often leads to some sort of suffering. And so the more I accept that fact, the less I expect. So can we look at our sense of disappointment and understand what is the expectation behind it? And again, not thinking in terms of what is fair or unfair, but simply understanding that reality doesn't always conform to our desires. And when we're disappointed, we're really in resistance to reality. So can we learn to accept reality as it is without trying to force our ideals and obligations upon it? Because that just doesn't work. All it does is cause us frustration. So can we just notice how our frustration with life is often due to our inability or unwillingness to accept reality by letting go of expectations? So in my own life, when I really take notice of my disappointments, I realize that I'm not upset merely because of the way circumstances have unfolded, but more specifically because I had a specific idea in mind of how I wanted those circumstances to unfold. And the outcome didn't match up with my desire. So what is the real cause of my disappointment? Is it the circumstances? Or is it because I'm so attached to an idea in my mind of how I wanted things to go? What if I didn't have that desire? Would there be any disappointment? And in all honesty, I can't say that there would be. So really, we need to work toward letting go of our attachment to specific outcomes, which isn't to say that you don't try to work toward a specific outcome, but to simply be aware of the need for things to unfold in a specific way and the willingness to accept whatever the outcome may be, even if it's very different from what you had intended. So can we, in other words, go about performing actions without being attached to the results? And this might seem difficult or even impossible, but like anything else, the more you practice, the easier it gets. Eventually, you get to a point where you begin to recognize expectations as they arise, and knowing that circumstances don't always match up, that the outcome is ultimately uncertain, you learn to release more and more the attachment to that specific outcome. And if things do unfold in your favor, it's a pleasant surprise. And if they don't, well, you still find something of value within it, because every situation in life offers us something of value if we're really paying close enough attention. There's always some lesson to be learned, and sometimes the lesson may be nothing more than learning to let go of expectations. And so there needs to be a certain amount of trust in the flow of life and to be able to surrender to that flow. And when we have unfulfilled expectations, it's as if we're resisting that natural flow. We want to imagine that we know what is going to be the best scenario for our lives, and we want a path that is clear and smooth and easy, forgetting that challenges and difficulties are what offer us the best opportunities for growth. And in my own experience, thinking that I know what's best for me, turns out that oftentimes I'm wrong. Sometimes we want something that really isn't good for us. And when I look back at many of my unfulfilled expectations, I realize in retrospect that if things had worked out the way that I had wanted them to at the time, it still would have led to some sort of disappointment one way or the other, because that wasn't the right relationship for me, or the right job, or whatever the case may be. And I may not have understood that then, but now it's all very clear to me. So I can take that understanding and apply it in the present. I might want something specific right now, but if it doesn't work out the way that I want, then I have to consider that maybe I'm better off without it. And usually as time goes on, it does become clear to me that the circumstance I had desired was not really favorable after all, and I can be grateful that it didn't work out. So again, if we want to have less disappointment in life, we need to have less expectations. And if we want to have less expectations, then we simply need to bring awareness to the expectations we currently have and to get into the habit of noticing them when they arise. Not to try and resist them or push them away, but just to simply recognize and understand them, and specifically in relation to disappointment. And to also be in the habit of noticing disappointment as it arises, and to see that it's our expectations, not the circumstances, that are the actual cause of our frustration. And to simply surrender to that flow of life, to accept what is, to find meaning and value in every situation, whether favorable or unfavorable. To understand that every situation in life offers us the opportunity to learn and to grow.
If you find this content valuable, don't forget to like, share, and subscribe.